I was born in Richmond, California, and on September 16th, 1947.
Who are/were your parents, and were their occupations?
Okay, my dad was a sheet metal worker. He was a ship fitter in World War II and was a combat veteran of Normandy. Anyway, my dad was a sheet metal worker. My mom was a homemaker, and my dad's name was Marcus Riley. Mom was Mary Buck Riley. And they were both born in Arkansas and moved out here with their families in the 30s during the Dust Bowl.
Who are or were your siblings, names and genders, which, if any, served in the military? Okay.
Yeah, I have one brother, two sisters. One of my sisters is older, Sylvia Richmond. She's 74. She is living in Fresno. Actually, Clovis. She has Alzheimer's and lives with her husband. And my brother is just younger than me. He lives in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and his name is David Riley. And he tried to join the military, but couldn't get in because he had an injury, sports injury, when he was in high school, and they wouldn't take him in. And then I have a younger sister who lives in Visalia, and she is married. Her name's Sue Campbell, and her husband Larry, and they live in Visalia, and she's a homemaker.
What were your parents' or siblings' feelings about you joining the service?
Oh, I know they were both worried, concerned. My dad encouraged me not to go into the Army or the Marine Corps because of his combat experiences in the military of World War II. My mom was just afraid. You know, I was the oldest son, and I was when I went into the military, I was actually being drafted. I graduated from high school, Mount Whitney High School, in 1965. Went to College of Sequoias in Visalia for a year and a half. I sat out to work for a semester, and I got my draft notice. That was in July of '67, and I had like 2 weeks to report for active duty. My dad was concerned about me going to war because of the Vietnam War. It was just kind of kicking into high gear in '67. He encouraged me to join another service. I tried to join the Air Force. They were full, couldn't get me in. They didn't have a spot. I joined the Navy, couldn't get it in at Visalia, but they were able to get me in Bakersfield. So that's the reason I wound up going to the Navy. I didn't want to go to Vietnam.
I'm sorry, but this is the next question too. What primary and secondary schools or college did you attend?
Oh yeah, I went to College of Sequoias for general education. When I got out of the military, I went straight into my career as a life insurance underwriter, life insurance agent, and so I did training, had classes here through the American College. I got my chartered life underwriter in 1984, and chartered financial consultant also in 1984. So that was the only college experience other than on-the-job training and a lot of special classes that I had.
Did you hold any jobs before entering the service?
Yeah, I just worked fast food, and my dad had an air conditioning business, so I worked with him, and that was pretty much my work experience.
Can you tell us, okay, so now we're on the early days of service.
Okay.
Can you tell us about when you went into the military? Were you drafted or did you enlist? If enlisted, why did you join?
Okay. Again, why I joined is I had been drafted into the Army. I had 2 weeks to report for basic training, but rather than be sworn in as an Army, I went to Bakersfield, joined the Navy, and went into the Navy. And what was the other part of the question again?
If enlisted, why did you join?
Okay, that I enlisted in rather than be drafted. That meant I had a 4-year enlistment, where the draft was 2 years. So I did it basically to avoid going to Vietnam. I had a lot of my friends that got out of high school in '65 that went straight in to the Marines or Army, and they would write me letters and say, hey, don't let them draft you. So I was being encouraged from all sides not to be drafted.
And which branch did you enter? If enlisted, why did you choose that branch?
Okay, yeah, again, I kind of covered those questions, but I joined the Navy 1967 and got out of the Navy in 71, and that was the reason I went in.
What was your first assignment after basic training?
My first assignment, I was stationed, I was hoping to go to sea, go overseas. Right out of boot camp, I got sent to El Centro, California, right on the California-Mexico border, and my job was I was driving the commanding officer of the base, a Navy captain, and so I did that for a year, and the only great thing that happened out of there is I met my wife, and we got married about 5 years later.
Did you receive any specialized training? If so, what?
During my military career, I had some specialized training. I went to A school, which was basic propulsion and engineering. This was my second duty station. I was in Great Lakes, Chicago, at the Navy base there, and I went through about 3 or 4 months of just basic propulsion and engineering. Then I went into a B school. The B school was immediately afterward, again in Great Lakes, and that was for being an engineman. So I learned how to work on diesel I was a diesel mechanic, basically.
Did you receive any promotions? If so, could you tell me about them?
Well, I did receive a couple of promotions. Some of them were just time in the service. After you've been in for a while, you take a little test, you get promoted. The test I took for third class, which was E4, I took that at my duty station in the Great Lakes before I got sent on, and you have to pass. They don't tell you immediately if you've passed. I found out after I was in Vietnam that I'd passed, and I got promoted to E4, which is an engineman third class.
Okay, so now we're on wartime service.
Okay.
Where did you serve?
Okay. Well, again, that was my third duty station. I was, before I went to Vietnam, I got orders from after the Great Lakes to go to Vietnam. They were sending we had 40 guys in our class, all but 2 got sent to Vietnam and to work on the diesel engines. So my first duty station in Vietnam was in Da Nang. I was sent to Da Nang. Back up just a moment. I spent about 3 or 4 months in Coronado at the Naval Amphibious Base. It's the same base that they train Navy SEALs on. We were in another section. We didn't have the training quite nearly as difficult as Navy SEALs, but anyway, they kind of prepared us what we were going to do when we got into country, what it was like, that sort of thing. We had classes. Also, I spent a week at Camp Pendleton. They figure if we're over there in Vietnam, we might need to learn how to shoot. In the Army and Marine Corps, they teach you that's your one of your main duties. But they wanted us sailors to go over there, and if we had to defend ourselves, to know how to use small arms and small machine guns. And so that was the training I had before. Going forward, I got sent to Da Nang. I went there on my birthday, my 22nd birthday. That was my birthday present from Uncle Sam, was a free ride to Vietnam. So I was there for about 5 months at that duty station. I was assigned to a yard oil and gas. It was about a 300-foot long floating service station. We carried 300,000 gallons of diesel fuel, and we sat in Da Nang Harbor most of the time. We did get sent out on special deliveries. Once we went to Chu Lai. We also went to Qua Viet, which is right on the demilitarized zone, the DMZ, that separates South Vietnam from North Vietnam. And so we went up there, and that was quite an adventure getting up there. Anyway, on that particular trip, when we went to Qua Viet, we were putting sail. We had 300,000 gallons of diesel fuel on our ship, mini ship, and we set out, and a monsoon hit us, and we were sitting in the water, and we were flipping and flopping on the waves, bouncing up and down. The boat I was on, the YOG 131, was built in 1929. So it was way before World War II. And so we were wondering if it was even going to hold together. Our trip was about 60 miles. It took us almost 24 hours to get there. The only people that were up were the pilot up in the, he was steering the ship, and the on-duty engineman who was operating the equipment down in the bilges and down in the engine room. Other than that, the rest of our 10 men were strapped to their beds, or you would just get thrown out because we were heaving and throwing, and it was most everybody got pretty sick on that.
You said you had oil on it?
Yeah, we carried diesel fuel all the time, except for 1 or 2 times we carried JP5 jet fuel, which was highly flammable. And so our main job was to deliver fuel. So I was there for 5 months. And then at this point in time, the military command, because of the anti-war protests that were going on in the United States at that time, there was a lot of pressure for them to start pulling out troops. And one of the first things we were doing, we're preparing the South Vietnamese to take over some of our ships, some of our duties, eventually to take the entire thing over and try to fight their war on their own. So our ship was one of the first ships turned over, and we turned over to the Vietnamese command, and everyone who had just 2 or 3, 4 months left was sent home or sent to another duty station in the Navy. Those of us who had a longer enlistment left, I had 7 months left in my 1 year, and so they put us on a C-130 aircraft, shipped us south to Saigon, and so I went there. A couple days later, they took away my Navy dungarees and Navy uniform, gave me a Marine uniform with a helmet, an M16, and pretty much just a Marine uniform. And I knew I was in trouble then. My whole purpose of joining the Navy was to stay out of Vietnam. I was not only in Vietnam, but I was going to be going into a combat. And so it was kind of a shock. They put me in a Jeep after I got my uniform, sent me to a little place called Dong Tam, which was a Navy riverboat station, pretty big down in the Mekong Delta. And so I got my assignment. I was assigned to a Navy riverboat unit called Raid 71. That was a River Assault Interdiction Division. That was our unit. And I was with that unit for about 3 weeks, and that unit was turned over. We were turning over everything to a Vietnamese unit. And so I was part of, I became, instead of just a crewman on a boat, I became the advisor to Vietnamese sailors and under a Vietnamese command. So I was basically commanded by Vietnamese units as an advisor, and that's what I did for the next 7 months, 7 months there. And I've got a lot to say about that, but we'll move that on when you're ready for it. But anyway, it was a complete reversal of what I would thought I was going to do. I didn't have language training. I was joining up with some advisors who had already been to the Monterey Language Institute in Monterey, California, and that's where they learned to speak Vietnamese. I was at a disadvantage. I couldn't speak their language, and most of the Vietnamese crewmen that I served with couldn't speak English. They had learned a little bit working with military American advisors. So that was the beginning of my real combat experience. And I'll stop right there and see if you have another question.
Yeah, I'll do it on 10-15 minute warning.
how did you stay in touch? Oh wait, how did your combat wartime experience change you?
How is my experience?
Yeah.
Well, again, I served 7 months there. My main duty was we would be on patrol. I was an advisor. I go with 3 boats. These boats were about 50 feet long. One of them was the old World War II. We called them Tango Boats. They were basically the old World War II. You saw guys go to shore. They dropped down the turret, and guys would rush on shore. We were working with the Vietnamese Marines. Once in a while, we worked with American units, but most of the time at this point, we were working in conjunction with the Vietnamese ARVN, Army Republic of Vietnam. Our total crew, again, were Vietnamese Navy. So I'd go out with 3 boats and only one person that could speak some English. Usually it was one of their officers. And we patrolled the rivers 24/7 for 3 days. We would take a specific area where we had been assigned, usually 20, 30 miles from our little base. We had little bases on that just housed us when we weren't on the river, and they did basic repairs and gave us food. So we were up and down. I served on the Vam Co Dong and the Vam Co Tay rivers, which was, again, right in the heart of the Mekong Delta, which was pretty heavy with the enemy. The Viet Cong were the South, and there was the communists in the South trying to, it was basically a civil war. And of course, North Vietnam were communist, and they were the ones who were supporting the South. So they had regular troops that were supplied by Chinese communists and also Russian communists. So we did those trips. We would travel up and down the rivers during the daytime. At night, we would pull up on the banks. We would tie our boats off. And as soon as the sun went down, well, that's when we were usually going in, you would see millions of mosquitoes fly up as we pulled up on the banks. We drove our boats up on the banks, tied them off to a tree or something or a rock, and stayed there all night long. As soon as we got settled in, the Vietnamese crews lived on those boats all the time. And I was only on 3 days and at a 3-day tours, and then I would come back and rest a day or so, sometimes 2 days, and we'd go back out for 3 more days. So it was constant like that on patrol. And we sat all night long. The Vietnamese crew immediately went to sleep. They'd eat a little rice or whatever they were going to have for dinner, and they would immediately go to sleep. That was their way of life. I had to stay awake. I was given a starlight scope. They also gave me amphetamines to stay awake so I wouldn't fall asleep. So usually I was the only one awake all night long, using my starlight scope to, see if anybody was approaching or whatever. So we did that continuous. That was pretty much a seven months. The rest of that tour, and I think a total for both tours, I actually volunteered to go back again, which my parents didn't know, none of my family knew. They gave me a great big welcome home when I got back home with a big sign in front of the home, welcome home, Steve. And, everybody was celebrating. I'd come back from Vietnam, and then I had the news to tell my mom and my dad and my brother and sisters and friends I was going back again. They all thought I was pretty crazy, and at this point in time, I probably was a little whacked out because it was a way of life. Then I was pretty much indoctrinated into it. We would search sampans. We'd call them over. We'd search for contraband, for weapons, anything that was illegal. The Vietnamese sailors were there. Of course, they would call them over, and we would go through and search and see if they were, or if somebody wanted to turn themselves in from being Viet Cong, they called those Chu Hois, and once in a while we'd get somebody who was churning from the communist side to the American side. That was what we were trying to do. So we would take them to a command post on shore, a Vietnamese command post, and turn them over so that they could be re-indoctrinated into the South Vietnamese way of life. Where was I at? Once I get going,
You went back?
Oh yeah, when I went back. When I went back, our base had basically changed, and we were getting sent all the way to the furthest most south base in all of Vietnam. We were 150 miles south of Saigon, which was the capital. Saigon is now Ho Chi Minh City. And so we were the most remote outpost. You either went in by air or you went in by boats. There were no roads. And at this particular point, this place was called Solid Anchor. It was in Nam Can province, and it was what we called a free fire zone. Whenever we went out on patrol, if we saw something on shore, people, we considered them, they were considered enemy, and so we could fire on them anytime. We didn't have to get permission. Like up in the Mekong Delta, there were lots of villages and people, major rice growing area. We could only fired upon. But in the free fire zone, we could fire at any time. We usually didn't need to do that, but we were attacked day and night. I'll share one of my experiences about when my boat got hit by a rocket in a moment. But so that was my duty station when I got back. Got right back into the swing of things. It took us 5 days to go from the Delta down to Solid Anchor. It was one of the most active places where there were actually a lot of North Vietnamese regular troops, not just Viet Cong, and they were highly skilled soldiers. They infiltrated the country down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which ran the entire length of South Vietnam coming in. They would come in from Laos and also in Cambodia. So they were very well equipped, very well armed, and very good guerrilla warfare people. And so that's who we were combating. And I want to back up to before I went for my second tour. I was there when we went in. This was May of 1970. The United States made a major invasion into Cambodia. And in 3 days' time, we lost 37 boats in the river boats, sunk. These boats had 5-man boat crews. We were called the heavies. We carried, we had 20 millimeter cannons, 40 millimeter linked Honeywell grenade launchers. We had twin 50s, 30 caliber machine guns. Everybody had their own small arms. I carried an M79 grenade launcher and also an M16. And when we got in a firefight, we had much more armament. We also had 105s on some of our boats, monitor boats. They had basically a howitzer, a cannon. And but we were one of the most weaponized boats you could find. Where the PBRs, the river patrol boats, the ones that were 37 feet long, they basically had twin 50s and then smaller machine guns. They usually had 5-man crew. We had a 50-foot boat that was 14 feet wide that weighed 66 tons. We could go about 14 miles an hour or knots, and the tide was going at us about 6 or 8 knots. So we made very slow progress. Where the river patrol boats or the PBRs, they could go 35, 40, maybe 50 knots fast, and they had a lot of maneuverability. We were, they called us the heavies because we were on big, heavy, armored plated boats. But we were metal boats, and if we started going down, a lot of times we were down. So anyways, that's what I did. Did that for the next 6 months until the end of my Vietnam tour. I was in combat about 5 times, actual combat where we got in firefights. We got 5 minutes left?
Sir.
Okay. I was in combat, actual firefights about 5 times. On one of those occasions, my boat was hit by a B-40 rocket. This was right about midday. Our 3 boats were patrolling, and we were on the, trying to remember the name of the river. I can't remember it right now, but it was, we were taking fire from both sides on both banks, and they started shooting at our boats. I was taking a nap because I slept all day, or stayed awake all night. I would try to catch some Z's, get a little sleep in the daytime. Well, the Vietnam advisor came up, or the Vietnam sailor came up and said, VC, shoot, VC, shoot. And so I had to go up and find my radio, my map, and get my flak jacket and helmet on. So I'm running across this boat, trying to get into my spot. As soon as I got there and got my helmet on, we took a rocket, a B-40 rocket, in the side of the boat. Now this boat weighed 66 tons. It almost completely flipped over in the middle of the river. It was like that. Came back down, shattered my eardrums, shattered my nerves. I picked up my M16 and started firing so much. I had 50 rounds that went through. I had a special clip made for it, like a banana clip. It was glowing red hot. In the meantime, the other 2 boats, which were about 80 yards apart, they were taking fire too. I didn't know exactly where we were on the river because I'd been snoozing. So I managed to get the boat captain's attention. He showed me where we were, and I called in air support. Within 5 minutes, it seemed like the firefight was over because we had twin Phantom jets drop napalm on both sides of the river, and that pretty much ended the battle. They did send in Hueys and cleaned up. So that was the closest I came to actually getting wounded. If the shrapnel had gone up rather than down, I'd probably been decapitated or severely wounded, maybe died. Out of the 2,500 sailors that died in Vietnam, about 1,200, about half of them were pilots, and the other half were Vietnamese sailors on riverboats. So that was the closest I came to ending it. I know we're running short on time, so I'll kind of end the combat thing. Amazing experience. My post-war experience, I'll get into very briefly if I could.
That's what the next thing is.
Yeah, I came home from Vietnam kind of numb, you know. I got immediately out of the service. I got a 3-month early out so I could go back to college. Came back, tried to settle into life. I had not smoked nor drank prior to going to the school. I was pretty much a clean-cut kid. I came out, I was smoking 3 packs of cigarettes a day. Could drink most people under the table. I kind of went into a period of, well, I have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. I've had it for since my military, 50-some years now. And so I take medications that help me deal with the stresses. I've been through lots of counseling. I was in a Vietnam veterans group on PTSD. I actually spent 2 months at the National Center for PTSD in Menlo Park, and a lot of counseling later. Life goes on. I've been married almost 48 years, never been divorced, 2 great sons, 5 great grandkids, and I think for the first 25 years after I got back, I stuffed it, didn't talk about it. And about 1997, I started having real severe depression and anxiety, and went through the counseling and went to the National Center for just intensive counseling in 2001. And life is good. You know, my greatest experience, I guess, being in the military was I became a believer in Jesus Christ. I don't know if I could say this at school, but it was kind of one of those, what they used to call them foxhole conversions. but it worked for me. I've been a believer so.
Yeah.
Thanks for putting up with my yapping, guys.
Here you go. We just had these on.
Oh, awesome. These mean a lot. They mean a lot. We've got a lot of letters and stuff. Very good. All right. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Brandon? No.
Dylan.
Brandon. Kai.
Yes, sir.
I'll learn it. It takes a while. Appreciate it, guys. Thank you so much.